So I'm going to talk a bit about the results of several studies that we've recently completed on the drivers of deforestation and forest degradation as a lead into some of the technical discussion that we're going to have here around this question today. Why are we worried about the drivers of deforestation? Well, first of all, it's essential for REDD strategy and policy design. Okay? If you don't understand what's causing your deforestation, it's very difficult to design policies to alter the course of what's happening on the landscape. You need to link policy and implementation of REDD Plus to broader development objectives. Deforestation is happening on the ground for specific reasons, and we have to understand how those reasons link to the well-being of people and how we're asking them to change what they're doing, and we still need to be able to ensure that they're going to be able to achieve their aspirations for their own livelihoods. It also helps us prioritize engagement with non-forest sectors. We often hear that the drivers of deforestation are outside the forest sector by and large, and if we understand what the drivers are, we can actually begin to set some priorities as to how we're going to engage with these actors. It does require resources, okay, and it requires additional efforts in addition to just estimating and reporting greenhouse gas emissions if you're going to monitor your drivers and understand how your drivers are changing over time and understand how your policies are affecting your drivers. Countries also need to integrate and combine capacity development efforts for monitoring drivers with ongoing work in national forest inventory. So it's not just about measuring diameters and heights of trees. We actually need to build capacity for monitoring the drivers of deforestation. I'd like to just stop for a second and talk about a few definitions. We talk about sort of proximate and underlying drivers of deforestation. The proximate drivers are the immediate human activities that cause deforestation and affect forest cover. For example, for deforestation, the direct drivers are commercial agriculture, subsistence agriculture, mining, infrastructure, urban expansion. And for forest degradation, it's things like logging, fires, livestock grazing in forests. Fuel wood collection is a big one, charcoal production, things that leave the forest ecosystem somewhat intact but degraded and often with lower carbon stocks. The underlying causes are a little more complex. In some cases, they're markets that are even external to the country, but these are the result of the interactions of social, economic, political, cultural, and technological processes that are not necessarily happening on the ground in the forest or even in the forest communities that are creating the incentives and the reasons why we're seeing the proximate drivers happen. Now, assessment of deforestation and forest degradation drivers that we undertook here, we first started off with looking at countries involved in REDD Plus readiness activities, and we took a first inventories of what countries are identifying as the main drivers of deforestation. We looked at our PINs, our plans. We actually conducted a number of country profiles on specific countries to get some information. We used the publication by Matthews et al. We looked at how countries are reporting drivers. Are they using nominal scales, ordinal scales, ratio scales? And we pulled data out for 46 key non-Annex 1 countries that represent almost 80% of the total forest area in the analysis I'm about to present. One thing that we noticed that countries actually have fairly limited data on drivers at the national level, and they're only just beginning the efforts to collect this information. So when we're talking about in the SUBSTA or in the UNFCCC, in the LCA discussions this morning about the need to be practical, I think it was PNG that said, please, when you do this stuff, be practical, understand where we are today, and don't ask us to do the top-notch analyses as the first cut. This is a part of the importance of the stepwise approach, is starting with what you have and then building up progressively. Okay, and countries right now don't have very much. There is a very limited data, and it's not very quantitative on what the drivers are. We organized some of the analysis across what's called the forest transition curve, and if you look at the y-axis, we have forest cover, but you could also think of it as carbon, if you like. And over time, countries tend to go through a progression. They go from high forest, low deforestation. As deforestation becomes incipient, they go through a transition that accelerates over time. As landscapes become depleted of forest, deforestation slows down, and very often there's a recovery of the forest either through setting land aside and allowing natural regeneration or through tree planting exercises. And this is how countries sort of we classified countries along this transition curves, with the dark green being the pre-deforestation countries, and the light colored cream being the post-transition countries, where we actually see forest cover increasing, like China, India. The pre-transition countries are some of the Western Amazon countries and Congo Basin countries. And just to sort of validate the model, we took a look at the relationship between the fraction of the biome remaining in forest in these countries, and looked at what the current deforestation rate is. And so the pre-transition countries you see in the lower left-hand corner with high forest cover and reasonably low deforestation rates. The rates increase a bit as you get into the low deforestation, the incipient transition part of the transition curve. They increase significantly on the accelerating part of the transition curve, and they come back to something similar to the initial rates as you get into the post-transition part of the curve. Okay, so deforestation actually follows a fairly predictable pattern. Okay, and it seems to bear out across the countries that we analyzed. Now, the forest degradation drivers for each continent play out like this. And you can see that agriculture is, by and large, a very large portion of of the drivers of deforestation. And commercial agriculture in many parts of the world exceed subsistence agriculture as a driver. Okay? The one place where, and this is perhaps not completely true, would be Africa, where commercial agriculture is about equivalent to subsistence agriculture. Okay? But commercial agriculture is still important in Africa, and it is a major driver of deforestation. Okay? The other things like urban expansion, infrastructure development, and mining are much smaller portions, but we see that in Asia they're a much bigger part of the pie than they are in, say, Latin America. This is the way that the degradation drivers play out across the continents, and I think it's very interesting that in Africa, it's not so much. It's a very different story than you see in Latin America and in Asia. Okay, timber and logging are the big drivers in America, in the Americas, and in Asia. Fuel wood and charcoal production are the major drivers in Africa. Okay? If you had to take a guess, this is pretty much what you would guess, but this is actually what plays out in the data as well. Okay? And this means the policies that you would want to implement and the way you would want to go about monitoring it are probably fairly different. This is how it plays out across the transition curve, and it plays out in actually a fairly predictable and consistent way. And this is good, because when it's fairly predictable and consistent, we can actually generate some more generic types of policies and approaches to it. But as we see that the deforestation ratios are fairly constant for agriculture, decreasing perhaps a little bit as you move into late transition, but they're fairly constant across the transition curve for agriculture. And it's the other ones that tend to change more consistently, with mining becoming less important over time, and urban expansion increasing over time. Okay? The types of things you might expect. Okay? And it's nice to see that these things play out well, because we can then use this to be more efficient in our monitoring systems. When we talk about the indirect drivers or the underlying causes of deforestation, we often hear countries talking about economic growth, and in particular countries that have a large portion of deforestation based upon export commodities. Economic factors are a major portion of what's underlying some of the deforestation. Population growth is another key element associated with urban growth as well. And demand for timber and agricultural products is a major growth factor. And in the future, we expect all of these to actually increase in most tropical areas. Population is increasing. Economic growth has to increase, because the status quo in many of these countries is not acceptable. And demand for timber and agricultural products, as these countries develop, are going to become more and more local. So we need to move from the current unsustainable trajectory that we're on into more sustainable ways of producing the products and services that these societies need. Okay? Countries with the national REDD plans identified weak forest sector governance, institutions, and conflicting policies in the forest sector as a major underlying driver. Okay? In 93% of the countries that we looked at, they identified this. 51% of the countries identified population growth as a major contributor to deforestation, and poverty and insecure tenure were both rated important by 48% of the countries that developed these implementation plans. So I'd like to just close with an illustration of how the different drivers affect the trajectories of carbon on landscapes, and use that to underscore the point that the types of land use change that are happening, the drivers actually do have an impact on monitoring. And if we take these into account, we should actually be able to put in place more cost-effective approaches to monitoring. We have over here the deforestation, the human-induced disturbance that causes the loss of fire. It could be from clearing, logging, fires and things like that. And the carbon pretty much does this, right, as areas remain deforested. We could see a recovery following the deforestation event and natural regrowth, and the carbon trajectory would look like this. We could see a conversion to agroforestry, and the carbon trajectory would look like this. There may be some ups and downs with harvesting and things like that, but by and large, across large landscapes, there would be a fairly constant carbon content. We could see future disturbances and that prevent regrowth and a degradation, a progressive degradation of the forest. We could see continuous logging. And in this case, it's slowly decreasing as you know, following rotations, you see a decrease in carbon stocks and decrease in productivity. We could have shifting cultivation, which has a carbon trajectory like that. We could have plantation forestry coming in following a deforestation event. Okay? The idea here is that because we have different carbon trajectories, one size does not necessarily fit all for MRV, and we could actually be, if we understand what the carbon trajectories are on the landscape, we can be much more efficient in designing our data acquisition procedures to take advantage of this. So the conclusions of the study are that agriculture is a main deforestation driver. It accounts for about 80% of the deforestation across the world, and we actually need to deal with this dichotomy. It cannot be either agriculture or forest. It has to be both agriculture and forest. We need to engage constructively with the agricultural community to address these drivers and come up with better land management and planning. A major degradation driver for Latin America and Asia is logging, over 70%. Fuel wood and charcoal are the main degradation drivers for Africa. Okay? Impact from monitoring. Each deforestation and degradation process requires a specific approach to monitoring. Okay, and countries currently have limited data on drivers at the national forest level, at the national level. One of the things that we don't see is much discussion about the drivers of the plus. What are the drivers of sustainable forest management? What are the drivers of forest conservation? These are not being addressed, and these are actually things that we want to be promoting. So I think one of the new challenges for the scientific community and for the NGO community, the development community, is to understand what are the drivers of some of these more positive types of behaviors that we would like to see, and how can we begin to integrate them into MRV systems. Thank you very much.